Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my Sick Sad World. And like any world, surviving and thriving often requires some amount of education. It doesn't have to be world class, it just has to be useful, relevant, and well taught, preferably by people who are motivated and qualified. But sadly, that kind of education is difficult to obtain and even more difficult to impart if you're a teacher. And on top of that, many modern education systems don't do a particularly good job of teaching kids these vital skills. And in a sense, I was lucky. I actually went to a school that many might classify as above average, at least in terms of funding and staffing. And yet I didn't feel like the education I got there was particularly useful. Even when my teachers were decent, their whole approach to educating kids just sucked, for lack of a better word. Now, I could talk for hours about why I felt that way, but instead of belaboring those dark times in my life, I want to use this video to present a measure of hope for education, one that I hope teachers, students, and parents alike can appreciate. And, ironically enough, that hope comes courtesy of Daria, the misanthropic animated teen from the MTV show that bears her name. I praised this show before in other videos, and rightly so. It really did speak to an entire generation, one who felt like the system had failed them, and not just in terms of education. And over time, this show has only come to resonate with people more and more. Because Daria, being a teenage girl during the height of 90s era prosperity, was in the best possible position to benefit from that system. But like everything else in her sick, sad world, she did not hide from the ugly truth. And for multiple seasons, she made no secret of how much she hated high school. And in multiple episodes, school and the adults within it were often a major source of conflict. But in one particular episode, Season 5, Episode 6, entitled Lucky Strike, she does something remarkable. Daria dares to make the case that modern education doesn't have to suck. It can even lead to meaningful personal developments for certain people. It almost sounds out of character. Daria giving us genuine hope in anything, especially something as sucky as high school. But I promise you, there are some uplifting sentiments within that iconic monotone voice of hers. And beyond offering a better perspective about education, she offers a message that even the most shallow, superficial among us can grasp. And yes, that's a direct reference to Quinn Morgendorffer. And yes, I have a lot to say about her. But for this video, I'm going to focus on her role in fleshing out the message within this particular episode. I'll save deeper discussions about Quinn for other videos. Now, to fully appreciate the message of this episode, it's also necessary to understand something about the supporting cast of Daria. Much like her parents and peers, the adults in Daria's world have many eccentricities, often to the point of absurdity. And that definitely extends to the staff of her school, Lawndale High. And the two key figures for Lucky Strike are Mr. Anthony DiMartino, a temperamental history teacher, and Principal Angela Lee, a penny-pinching, egocentric, security-obsessed administrator. Now, to put it mildly, both characters are quite colorful in their own right. Throughout the series, Mr. DiMartino has been constantly annoyed, frustrated, and enraged about what he has to deal with as a teacher. He very clearly hates his life, the system, and what he has to deal with on a regular basis. Daria just happens to be one of the few students that doesn't make his eye bulge angrily. He's an unstable, but overall sympathetic character for the most part. By contrast, there is nothing sympathetic about Principal Lee. She's less a principal and more power-hungry authority figure. For much of the show, she never shows any fondness for children, let alone educating them. She's more concerned with being glorified for her work and securing the necessary funding for doing so. In essence, these are not the people you want in charge of educating your kids. That much is made clear by this point in the show. They're also both byproducts of a very flawed education system, one that's less focused on educating and more focused on getting whatever they can out of it. And these flaws are front and center at the start of Lucky Strike. Mr. DiMartino and the other teachers are negotiating a new union contract, And not surprisingly, Principal Lee is trying to stiff them at every turn, doing whatever she can to pay them as little as possible so that she has more funds for her goals. Naturally, negotiations break down quickly, and as a result, the teachers go on strike. But, much to the chagrin of the students, classes aren't canceled. It just means they'll be taught by substitutes, who may or may not be qualified to teach high school students in any capacity. This naturally leads to some major mishaps, such as enlisting a senile old woman and an overtly creepy middle-aged man to teach a bunch of teenagers. And it's that last one that gets Daria caught up in this mess. Because when said creepy teacher starts perving on one of the female students, Daria's mother, a skilled lawyer, gets involved. And, having clashed with Principal Lee before, she gets the school to take more drastic measures. And that is what leads Daria to teach an English literature class, one that just happens to be populated by her sister, Quinn, and her fashion club cadre of mean girls, Tiffany, Stacy, and Sandy. And if you've been following the show to this point, you can appreciate how hilariously fitting that is. You see, one of the running gags in this show is just how different Quinn and Daria are. Whereas Daria is smart, misanthropic, and antisocial, Quinn is basically the exact opposite. She is a textbook popular girl, cute, sociable, and always attracting attention from boys who want to date her. She's also exceedingly shallow, obsessing over her looks and her popularity along with her like-minded friends in the fashion club. And because of these differences, Quinn spends most of the series denying she's even related to Daria. She also avoids her whenever she can, trying to distance herself from anything Daria's involved in. Now, it's rarely out of hate or spite. She's just worried about being affiliated with someone as unpopular as Daria. Now, this was often a way of belaboring just how shallow Quinn was, as well as how different she was from her sister. And for me personally, it made her one of the least likable characters in the whole show. Yes, she was no Principal Lee, but she was a hard character to root for in any capacity. Now, in this episode, Quinn has to contend with Daria teaching her class, and it puts her in an awkward situation, especially among her fashion club friends. Sandy, in particular, has always been extra harsh with her, especially towards Daria. But she's also one of the few characters who can say her popularity status is greater than Quinn's. And now, Sandy is in a unique position to undermine the popularity that Quinn holds so dear. And on top of all that, Daria is in a good position to make Quinn miserable. She really could have done any number of things to annoy her, as sisters are wont to do. And given how Quinn has treated her over the course of the show, you could argue that she would be justified in doing so. However, Daria doesn't go that route. Instead, she ends up doing something remarkable, and oddly enough, Quinn is the biggest beneficiary. You see, Daria actually does make an effort to teach this class. She doesn't just pass out assignments and sit at the teacher's desk. She actually tries to make the class engaging. As it just so happens, the class was about to study Romeo and Juliet, a basic assignment for any high school English class. But instead of crafting these generic assignments, Daria takes a different approach. She actually challenges the students to read the play and actually think about it. She doesn't try to get them to come up with the right answers. She encourages them, a bunch of teenagers, to understand the play on their own accord. Now, that may not sound like much, but in the context of the show, as well as education in the real world, it's downright radical. All too often, modern education is built around getting students to remember certain facts so that they can pass a test. Whether it's math, science, history, or literature, it almost always comes back to the test. And I myself can certainly remember that approach when I was in school. Learning a subject was less about actually understanding it and more about memorizing what you needed to in order to pass the tests. And that overly bureaucratic approach to education is often reflected throughout the Daria series. Most of the teachers, even the less traditional ones like Timothy O'Neill, always seem to teach with a test or assignment in mind. To them, teaching students means educating them enough to complete these tasks, and that's the end game. Whether or not they actually understand what they're learning, that always seems to be an afterthought. But that approach is antithetical to Daria's worldview, which often comes back to thinking for yourself. She has never been one for rigid conformity, especially when it stifles meaningful thought. So of course she doesn't take the same traditional approach to teaching. She knows firsthand how much it sucks. So instead, she just does what she can to get the students thinking and engaging with the material on their own. And remarkably, it actually works. She manages to get the class thinking deeper about the play. Even some of the airheaded guys who flirt with Quinn feel the effect. And even if their thoughts are objectively dumb or empty, Daria doesn't scold them for it. She doesn't say they're wrong. She just encourages them to think longer and deeper about the material. It's kind of like a one-woman protest against modern education, a direct counter to a teaching process that so many of us deem immutable. And while the teachers and administrators are fighting over coffee creamer in a union contract, Daria is teaching a bunch of teenagers in a meaningful way. Even though she didn't choose this task, she still makes the most of it, and the students in her class are better because of it. Well, most of them, but I'll get to that in a bit. Because while Daria is teaching this class in her own unique way, Quinn is still worried about what could come of all this. Sandy is more critical of her than ever, calling Quinn out every time she tries to make excuses for Daria. You get the sense that she's goading Quinn into admitting a connection that she doesn't want to admit, something that would likely undermine her popularity. And with all this going on, Quinn still has to pass the class, and that causes a lot of distress for her. She knows Daria is in a position to make it harder. And again, Daria could, if she wanted to, use her position to humiliate Quinn in front of everyone. And I imagine many who followed this show would have loved to see that. However, that kind of vindictiveness just isn't Daria's style, and it never has been. She's not the kind of person who just wants to make her enemies suffer. Even though she is in a clear position of authority, she chooses not to go that route. She basically treats Quinn the same way she treats everyone else in the class. And it's here where something remarkable happens with Quinn. Something that would have been unthinkable just a couple seasons ago. Quinn Morgendorffer, one of the most shallow characters in the show, actually has a moment of introspection. After nearly 5 seasons of Daria, something happens in her brain that finally clicks, and for once it has nothing to do with eyeliner. Quinn realizes that she actually knows the material that Daria is teaching. She's not thinking about the test, the assignment, or how Daria might use her position against her. She actually genuinely understands the material. She read Romeo and Juliet, and she knows it, more so than she thought she did. It's a small but subtle epiphany, one that nicely reflects the larger message of the episode with regards to education. Quinn was so obsessed over the assignments and tests of her class that she forgot about the actual substance of the material. And unlike her ditzy fashion club friends, she gave it real thought. Then, when the test finally does come, she's ready for it. And the format of the test is also unorthodox in how Daria structures it. Instead of just asking students about random details or who stabbed who in the play, the test consists of one simple question. What is Romeo and Juliet about? And support your answer. That's it. No multiple choice, no fill in the blank. It's a simple prompt. All it requires is that you actually read the play, understand it on some level, and put some thought into justifying it. It's such a jarring approach that even some of the students in Daria's class are confused. It's as though they've never taken a test that allows them to answer it in their own unique way. And as someone who took many tests on many Scantron sheets, I really appreciated this moment. It wasn't just true to Daria's underlying philosophy about thinking critically. It highlighted how learning involves more than just memorizing details and regurgitating those details on a standardized test. And in the end, those who actually do the thinking get a good mark on this test. Daria doesn't look for the quote-unquote right answers. She looks for the answers that had real thought put into them. Even if they were somewhat dumb and shallow, she rewarded them for actually making an effort to support their response, whatever it might be. And for those who actually understood the play, like Quinn, they did really well. Quinn ends up getting a B+ on the test, whereas Sandy and the Fashion Club failed, mostly because they didn't bother reading the play, let alone put any thought into it. And this eventually sets the stage for what, in my opinion, was the most defining moment of the episode. After all the grades are handed out, and after Quinn finds out she got a high mark, she's confronted by Sandy once again. But this time, Quinn doesn't cower. Instead, she goes on the offensive, effectively telling Sandy, in not so many words, that she can ruin her popularity just as easily as she can ruin hers. And then, in a moment I never thought would happen, Quinn admits that Daria is her sister. It took 5 seasons, a teacher strike, and a radical reimagining of how America approaches education, but it happened. Quinn Morgendorffer admitted that Daria was her sister. It wasn't coerced, and it wasn't admitted out of shame either. She even smiles when she says it. It was a great moment for Quinn, of which she has had precious few to this point. And it was a great moment for Daria as well, because Daria never forced her hand or anything. She just did her own thing and let the chips fall where they may. And for once, Quinn decided to do right by her sister. And on top of that, Quinn found a way to humiliate Sandy as well. She actually thought that Quinn's admission would be devastating. But in reality, Sandy turned out to be the only one who didn't know. And it wasn't because she was stupid, it's that she was so self-centered that she didn't bother to think about it. And as a result, she became the butt of the joke, if not a cautionary tale for the overall theme of the episode. Daria might not have been a trained teacher, complete with degrees, certifications, and union representation. But she was able to teach a class of disinterested teenagers about Romeo and Juliet. And she didn't do it with tests and assignments either. She did it by simply encouraging them to think and engage. She basically did what modern education instructs teachers to avoid in favor of focusing on test scores. But from Daria's perspective, test scores don't prove you know or understand anything. So she just went around all that crap and got the actual goal of helping students understand a concept. Her approach might have been basic and blunt, but it worked. And getting those students to think harder had other benefits. For Quinn, it helped her realize that she was smarter than her shallow persona would have anyone believe. It also helped her realize that Daria, for as much crap as she gave her, is still her sister. And she's a damn good sister too. She might be weird at times, but she's also understanding, thoughtful, and genuine. And those were all things she never got from the Fashion Club, or the guy she dated for that matter. And at last, she was ready to embrace that connection. Prior to this episode, Quinn was just starting to evolve as a character. She had started distancing herself more and more from the Fashion Club, and she began pursuing things that didn't just involve being cute and going on dates. But in Lucky Strike, we got the first sign that these pursuits were having a larger effect on Quinn. And they would go on to play a major role in future episodes, leading right up to the finale. And it was a great moment for her, as well as Daria. Now eventually, the teacher strike does end, and the teachers do get their brand new union contract. Daria goes back to her own classes while Quinn goes back to more traditional education. There were some other side plots in this episode, including one involving Trent and Mr. O'Neill, but those plots were largely secondary. In terms of the bigger picture, Lucky Strike gave us a colorful look at the dynamics of this horribly flawed education system. While teachers and principals failed to work out legal disputes, Daria was still able to teach a valuable lesson to a bunch of teenagers who weren't there by choice. And she did so by going against the system and doing things her own way. Ultimately, she didn't just teach her students to appreciate Shakespeare. She and Quinn were in a better place as sisters because of this experience. And in any sick, sad world, that's a lesson worth learning. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks again for joining me in my sick, sad world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.